Oh, is this going to film?
Smile.
Hi guys, how are you? All right, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Danielle Stovall, first year PhD student with you guys. So today I get the honor of introducing Majlesi. She's the Associate Director of our Emergency Preparedness and Homeland Security Institute in New Brunswick. So I've known Ava for 2 years now. She was my former professor, mentor, and now a dear friend. So let me give you her background. She went to Rutgers and has quite the distinguished academic and professional career here. She holds her bachelor's in psychology and political science. She graduated in 2003, graduated from our law school in 2007, and in 2014, she became the associate director, like I said, of our Homeland Security program. She is developing the undergraduate curriculum. You can read her bio. She's got a pretty impressive track record of setting up courses. So pretty much what the Homeland Security Institute does is pipe students into the intelligence field. So one of her success stories is me, because I work for the FBI now, so I have to give her a lot of credit for that career jump. So I'll turn it over to her, and she could talk to you guys for the next hour.
Thank you, Danielle. Thanks for introducing me. One of my best former students, so it's great to have you here. Thank you so much to the Division of Global Affairs and Manasa for inviting me here today. I thought before I got started and really diving into the material, I would just tell you a little bit about my various roles at the university. So I'm the program director for the Rutgers Intelligence Community Center for Academic Excellence, shorthand ICCAE. So what does that mean? Back in January 2015, Rutgers received this federal designation as an ICCAE through the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was a competitive grant. We were awarded a multi-million-dollar grant to develop educational programs in intelligence and national security and really sort of train that next generation of students who would enter the workforce in the intelligence community. So what are some of the things we've been working on to that end? I was part of a group that helped develop a minor in intelligence studies at Rutgers, New Brunswick, at the undergraduate level. We have finally got students who are formally declaring that minor. And I teach a number of courses within that program, including Introduction to Critical Intelligence Studies. We also have a certificate program in intelligence and national security that is open to all undergraduate students and graduate students from across all of Rutgers' 3 campuses. So you, as graduate students here at DGA, are eligible for that program. I would encourage you to all consider it. This summer we did a 4-day program at Rutgers, New Brunswick. 2 days were heavily focused on lectures from various experts throughout the intelligence community. So you had folks from the FBI, we had folks from DHS, from a number of state agencies who were talking to students about various topics in the field of intelligence and national security. Also part of that certificate program, students were learning how to write and brief for the intelligence community. It's a very different type of writing than what you see in sort of traditional academia. And we also had the New Jersey Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness. They came in and they did 2 days of sort of a real life simulation exercise with students where the students were broken down in groups. They were working as intelligence analysts on a real scenario that you might face if you were working within the intelligence community. So it's very hands-on, provides you access to networking with individuals in the field. If it's a career choice that you're thinking about, I would encourage you to apply and hopefully I can get your contact information if you're interested and add you to my newsletter. I'm, constantly sending out information about various internships and opportunities within the intelligence and national security field. So, as I mentioned, I do teach courses in that program. I also serve as the academic advisor for that minor and for students across the university who are interested in this field. And I also, I wear various hats here. I also happen to be the program manager for the Faith-Based Communities Security Program, which I'm going to tell you more about today. So, I work very closely with John Farmer. He's a former dean of Rutgers Law School. He's special counsel to the president of the university, and he happens to be the director of the program that I'm going to tell you about today. And this is a quote for him, so let me just read that for you. So the new reality of violent extremism requires an unprecedented level of community engagement with police. Community police partnerships and engagement practices are at the heart of a responsive and resilient community to help detect, prevent, and respond to violent extremism. We are working to expand capacity around building and strengthening communities of trust through the research and application of good practices. So, in May 2014, we developed a program, the Faith-Based Community Security Program, as a result of the terrorist attack on the Jewish Museum of Brussels and the rising tide of anti-Semitism and intolerance generally. We are going to be launching a new center for community protection and resilience in the coming months, and that center is really a direct outgrowth of the work that we've been doing overseas and here domestically on that faith-based community security program. There was a real recognition that, intolerance is on the rise, not only here, but you're seeing it all across Europe as well. It's really become an issue. Very soon after we launched this program, we started to see terrorist attacks that were taking place in public settings. It's not only hard targets anymore. We're talking about soft targets like stadiums, cafes, subway stations, airports. You're seeing the desecration of religiously affiliated buildings, schools, homes. There are mass killings that are taking places in churches, in mosques, in temples, in synagogues all across the world. And it's really underscored for us here at Rutgers the vulnerabilities of certain populations and the growing levels of violence that are taking place not only in Europe but also right here at home. And I think just the attack that took place in Las Vegas, if anything, underscores the difficult reality that we're facing and sort of this evolving threat environment that we're in. So. Back to our program at Rutgers, which shorthand I'm going to call FBCSP. We determined that really the best way to identify best practices for providing safety to diaspora communities would be to examine the practices that were employed by the world's original diaspora community, which is the Jewish community in Europe. So to that end, we had a team of researchers and experts visiting various communities, government agencies, private sector entities in a variety of places. So we've been to London, Paris, Amsterdam, Stockholm, Malmö, Sweden, Budapest, Prague, Brussels, Vienna, Copenhagen. The list goes on and on, trying to distill best practices that these communities have been using. We had our team meeting off-site with representatives of the Jewish communities in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Finland, Ukraine, Greece, Romania. They met with representatives of the Parish Jewish community in the immediate aftermath of the attack that took place on the kosher grocery store. Our team was with the Copenhagen community in the immediate aftermath of the murder of one of its members, who was actually there to secure the synagogue. And we were also there immediately after the Brussels attack that took place in their subway system and in their airport in the spring of 2016. So from all of these experiences, from meeting with these community members, meeting with government representatives, and also working with communities right here in the US. So in Dearborn, Michigan, Cook County, Illinois, and Hennepin County in Minnesota, the Rutgers team has really distilled a number of practices that range from physical facilities protection to police community relations in order to help promote practices that will help protect these vulnerable communities. Right now, we're in the process of developing a guide, an online guide that various communities can use to sort of determine what best practices might work best for their own communities. And the plan is that we will announce the publication of that guide when we announce the launch of this new center at the university. And we will be, continuously updating that guide. And that's actually where student participation comes in. We'll likely be engaging students from across the university who have an interest in the field and want to engage with the program and work on this guide. So be on the lookout for information about that program. So as we were engaging in this work, this research and fact-finding process, the nature of the threat to these communities had actually been evolving. So you see the emergence of ISIS, you see sort of really an enhanced use of online extremist recruiting. And you're seeing a change from an emphasis on really well-coordinated cells of terrorist activity to a promotion of individual lone wolf type attacks or wolf pack attacks. And you're also seeing the emergence of these encryption technologies that could disguise future plots. And this evolution has really had two transformational effects. So there are now so many potential attackers out there that law enforcement really can no longer handle this type of threat on its own. There's just no way to track every potential threat that exists out there. But also really the means of detecting emerging threats, threats that move at quote unquote the speed of light, as former FBI Director James Comey has said, have really been compromised. So to an unprecedented degree, communities really have to seize upon the initiative for providing their own safety. I don't claim to sit here and have all of the answers because there really is no cookie cutter approach to tackling these types of issues. There are individual differences within every community, within different localities, and so you really have to, each community really needs to sort of take a hard look at its own practices and determine what practices they need to employ to help better protect their communities. So as a result of some of this work that we were engaging in, we were invited by the Brussels community in Molenbeek and Sablon, two neighborhoods within Brussels, the Belgian law enforcement community, the Egmont Institute, and the Belgian Interior and Foreign Ministries. Experts at Rutgers developed a unit specifically for Brussels on police training that really focused on enhancing police community trust. That particular unit was delivered in July 2016, and then in November 2016, to prepare for the community phase and the community engagement phase of the training, we co-hosted a forum with the Egmont Palace, at the Egmont Palace, that really focused on enhancing police community relations. So we developed a community-based training based on all of the expertise that our team had developed. We delivered that training in June 2017 in both Molenbeek and Sablon. And as a result of that work, we've now been invited to assist a number of other communities. So Denmark, Sweden, the UK, communities within the US. And we're planning to undertake this work, which is an outgrowth of this earlier program. We're going to undertake that work as part of this new center at Rutgers. So why don't we dive into this a bit more deeply. So defining violent extremism. Violent extremism is a process of taking radical views and putting them into violent action. I just want to make a point of clarification. Radical thinking is by no means a problem. It only becomes a threat to national security when citizens, residents, or a group of individuals promote or engage in violence as a means to further their radical political, ideological, or religious views. Part of what we're seeing is that motivations and drivers that may inspire individuals to violent action might be due to real or perceived grievances. And we're going to get into that a bit further in my presentation. So what do we mean when we're talking about targeted violence? So the Secret Service defines targeted violence as situations in which an identifiable or potentially identifiable perpetrator poses or may pose a threat of violence to a particular individual or group. So in the context of mass casualty attacks, what does this all mean? I don't think it will come as a surprise to you that mass casualty attacks are a growing threat here in the United States as well as Europe. What we're seeing is that the tempo of attacks is increasing, and often individuals who engage in this type of violence do not have any sort of formal operational connection to an international terrorist or a domestic extremist organization. But the fact of the matter is that groups like ISIS, they're really effective at influencing vulnerable segments of our population using online propaganda and social media. So in addition to violent extremist behavior, we're also seeing a growing number of people who are turning to targeted mass casualty attacks in response to a perceived grievance. It's not necessarily for an ideological purpose. They might have a grievance at their workplace or at their school. They may have a domestic issue that's leading them to engage in this type of activity. And again, you know, when we're looking at the Las Vegas attack, I think I should underscore, you know, this was not the only mass casualty attack, mass casualty shooting, I should clarify, that took place in the United States this past week. There were 6 other mass shootings that did take place. It's a growing issue. It's something that we need to deal with as a nation.
Can you speak a little bit to the conversations in the media right now about why the Las Vegas attack isn't considered terrorism?
Sure, and I can give you my own personal opinion on that, sort of not any sort of official opinion. I think until they determine the attacker's motivation, they're going to be very reluctant to declare it a terrorist act, right? Because terrorism, part of the motive needs to be advancing a political aim or advancing, you know, an ideological or religious point of view, you know, and carrying out a violent act in the name of that political, ideological, or religious view. So until they sort of investigate that further and come up with some sort of motive, I think they're going to be very reluctant to categorize this as terrorism. So, any other questions? And I should mention, you know, please feel free, let's keep it really informal, feel free to chime in.
Okay, so if I understood your comments correctly, the cooperation, is your cooperation only limited to Europe? Because these attacks on schools, for example, in Pakistan or elsewhere, are very recurrent.
Yeah.
So is it that European countries, they approach you to extend some support, or you guys? Like you said, you went to, I mean, you were in Brussels, or
Right.
in Germany, or in Sweden, in UK.
Yeah.
But these attacks happen in Iraq, in Turkey,
Yes.
in Pakistan, in all those
Yes,
countries.
absolutely.
So-
Part of it is the contacts that we had in those areas, and part of it is, you know, that was just a starting point for the Rutgers team. Obviously, these incidents are happening all across the world. I think we would love to address them in all of those places that you mentioned. I know as we sort of launch this new center, I think we're going to be looking to identify and sort of work with additional communities, but it's a matter of, limited resources also, and just the fact that Europe was sort of a starting point for us. So I think we're hoping to expand our reach.
Yeah.
Okay. About offender backgrounds and characteristics that might be of concern. So we sort of categorize things into two buckets, right? There are individuals who might carry out these types of attacks because they are ideologically motivated. We're seeing an increased number of violent extremists who are self-radicalized, self-trained, they're self-executing, and they're ideologically oftentimes ignorant. The period of radicalization to violence can often be very brief. So, we could be talking about 1 to 2 months. It's become increasingly easier because individuals sort of have this phone attached to them that could really be a gateway to radicalization. And often, as I mentioned, there's really no operational link to a formal terrorist organization. The other category that we should not ignore is non-ideologically motivated attacks. Some individuals are reacting to non-ideological grievances by carrying out mass casualty attacks. There are definitely growing concerns over individuals who may engage in violence based on sort of this hyper-charged political environment that we're in right now. And going from flash to bang can happen very quickly again in a period of months. I should say both of these groups are heavily influenced through social media and internet usage. So progression to violence. And there by no means is there one sort of profile for the type of individual who is susceptible to radicalization or engaging in this type of conduct. But here are some of the things that we have seen. So, some of these individuals may be, on sort of the margins of the community. They may have a pattern of life failures. They might be searching for a social connection, a group to belong to. They're looking for a sense of belonging. So often, you might see parallels between gang recruitment and this type of recruitment. You might see increasing anger, articulation of some sort of grievance, and leaking that grievance. So oftentimes, folks on social media that are in that network, they're seeing this grievance being aired. There might be a stressor, a particular life event that triggers this type of violent act. And then you're seeing mobilization, so getting prepared to engage in this violent activity. Maybe the individual is starting to acquire materials to carry out their attack. They're scoping locations and targets to carry out their attack. They're doing pre-operational surveillance. And then finally, you're seeing the individual go to action and carrying out that act of targeted violence. So flash to bang, what are some of those behaviors of concern? And the source here is the Secret Service and the FBI. So the bottom line is that most of the time, what we're seeing is that these individuals are not unnoticed. There are potentially communications that reference a grievance. There are threats or veiled references of harming oneself or others, whether that is taking place in person or on social media, in a public internet forum, or through emails. Oftentimes, these individuals have an unusual interest in previous acts of targeted violence. You might see changes in behavior related to physical, social, criminal, or violent behavior. You might see differences in their occupational behavior, so they're declining in job performance, there's a change in their mood and their physical appearance, or in their daily routine. Maybe they're withdrawing from their friends or family. Maybe they're engaging in harassing behavior, conducting acts of vandalism, threatening communities. Maybe, as a bystander, you're witnessing acts of mobilization, so pre-operational surveillance, equipment and weapons acquisition, refinement of tactics, so they're honing their skills before they carry out, one of these potential acts, and conducting final acts, so leaving a goodbye message, giving away their belongings, breaking a lease on a residence, emptying a bank account. So there are often behaviors that a bystander has witnessed leading up to this type of attack. So, what are some of, yes?
I would like to draw a parallel with your experience in public administration and policy side by side. This intelligence, because the issue is that whether with the metrics that is available to call especially the Las Vegas shooting an act of terrorism or otherwise, it's still debatable. But when you consider the trends that are emerging, especially in this time, this is a new form of attack that is prominent in the West. Because when you see lone wolf operators, killing mass people, the Orlando nightclub attack is similar to this attack in Las Vegas. And it boils down to policy. How are this caliber of weapons is also a discuss in the US polity. How do they get access to this type of equipment that can lead to this kind of carnage? And we are still thinking about whether we are going to call it an act of terrorism or not, while we are also keeping something in the background. These weapons, how are they able to get this category of weapons? So I'm trying to see you draw from your experience in policy and intelligence, how they kind of connect.
So I agree with you. I think the motivation behind this type of attack, it's important, right? We want to know why someone would commit such a horrific attack. What is driving them to carry out, the mass killing of, innocent civilians? It's important to understand that motivation, but it's not everything, right? So in my opinion, there are other issues that as a society we need to confront and we need to address. So you mentioned access to weapons. So gun control, in my opinion, that's an issue that needs to be addressed legislatively, and it needs to happen now. It needed to happen back in 2012 when, innocent elementary school children were killed, And I'm speaking, these are my own personal opinions, but it's horrific that we have not addressed these issues. So yeah, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and am I optimistic that it's going to happen? Personally, no. If we didn't deal with it as a nation back in 2012 when that attack happened, and the attack that took place before that and before that and before that, these are not necessarily isolated incidences. We've been dealing with mass casualty attacks for a very long time now. So gun control is an issue that needs to be addressed. Mental health services in this country and the framework that we use to address individuals who are potentially at risk of progressing down a path of violence, that's an issue we need to address in this country. So there are a lot of root causes that are contributing. So, I can't speak to exactly how we should handle all of them, but these are issues that need to be dealt with. So I hope that answers your question from my point of view. Any other questions? So, in my opinion, traditional law enforcement strategies that have been utilized are insufficient to prevent all of these attacks. The FBI is under certain restrictions when they're engaging in threat assessments, right? So the FBI has to follow the Attorney General's guidelines for domestic FBI operations when they're utilizing counterterrorism resources. So there are guidelines that actually authorize the FBI to carry out investigations to detect, obtain information about, or prevent and protect against federal crimes or threats to national security, or to collect foreign intelligence. So the Attorney General guidelines state that to move past a preliminary investigation and begin utilizing counterterrorism resources that are at the FBI's disposal, there must be a showing that the individual under investigation has either been in communication with or is somehow connected to a designated foreign terrorist organization or with a suspected or known terrorist, or the individual's behavior is consistent with elements of a national security related crime. So for example, material support of a terrorist organization. So let me give you a few examples that illustrate this point. So let's say the FBI is conducting a preliminary assessment. They don't find the elements of a national security crime. They can't substantiate a connection to a designated terrorist foreign organization or a terrorist, but there are worrisome signs that an individual might have some mental health issues present. Under the current guidelines, the FBI faces restrictions in conducting a further investigation. So here's a prime example of that gap. The Fort Lauderdale airport shooting. 2 months before carrying out that mass casualty attack, the perpetrator walked into an FBI office with a loaded handgun. He reported that he had terroristic thoughts. Unable to meet the AG guidelines threshold to proceed with further investigation, the FBI took him to a mental health institution and he was freed 4 days later. 5 people were killed in that incident. These individuals are not unnoticed. The Orlando Pulse nightclub shooter that you referenced, Omar Mateen, the Manhattan Seaside Park bomber, Rahami, the Boston Marathon bombing, the older brother. These are all individuals who were brought to the attention of the FBI before they carried out deadly or life-threatening attacks. But the issue is that federal laws and guidelines, they're not keeping up with what is actually happening on the ground in state and local jurisdictions. So in light of this, we really have to think about moving beyond using traditional counterterrorism investigative strategies because there are limits that we are seeing from using sort of those traditional detect and arrest strategies in this current environment. These traditional strategies are not necessarily going to catch your lone wolf attacker. So what do we need to do about this? From our perspective, we really need to enhance and empower foster local partnerships between law enforcement, between communities they serve, with mental health professionals, with educators, with faith leaders, to identify at-risk individuals so that we're developing earlier forms of intervention before people carry out these types of attacks. So building community security and resilience. Why law enforcement? They're a visible extension of government's interest in protecting people and communities. More and more, I think we need to start seeing, law enforcement needs to see itself as, agents of social change. They need to engage in, innovative community policing strategies. If we want to build community security and resilience, we need to focus on engaging and enlisting key community members, citizens, civil society, business, police, and work together to ensure the safety and security of our communities in which people are living, working, worshiping, playing. So how can communities play a role here? There's a 2015 study that says that those in the best position to notice the early signs of individuals who are considering acts of violent extremism are those individuals' friends. Even more so perhaps than school counselors, than clergy, than family members, it is the friends. Now that is not to say, your school counselor, your coach, your clergy, your family member, that's not to say that these people are of little or no importance to the process in trying to counter violent extremism. They are. And of course it's possible that non-friend bystanders have noticed behaviors of concern. But typically it's the friends who notice something first. The issue is that bystanders, right, friends, family members, they are going to be reluctant to reach out to safety networks and try to intervene. And according to that study, the predominant reason that was underlying this reluctance was fear. The bottom line is that any efforts to counter violent extremism are going to be ineffective unless these gatekeepers with information are willing to step forward and share that information with law enforcement and other safety networks. So how do you get friends? How do you get relatives to refer potentially at-risk friends to law enforcement or other service providers? This particular study suggested an anonymous texting-based crisis prevention hotline. I think that's a good idea. I think anonymity will help encourage folks to step forward with information that could potentially be helpful to law enforcement. But I also think there needs to be a pre-existing relationship with law enforcement. There needs to be a baseline level of trust in law enforcement so that people feel comfortable knowing that there are intervention options that are available in a pre-criminal space. So before detect and arrest comes into play. So with that, I'd like to show you a couple of short videos.
When this type of thing happens and be able to invest such kind of funds into help. And again, when you look at the response of New York after 9/11, they set up their counterterrorism department and can compete with most national counterterrorism units in other parts of the world. Are states communities, or capitalism in America willing to give what it takes to really combat this effort? Because you look at it in the real sense of it, time has changed. Okay, this happenings 2012, months, you see it happening all the time. Are we willing to really go back? Apart from the political class who is foot dragging, considering the issue of NRA and the policy of guns, you find out that the community itself really need to do much. And until it happens, we're still going to be expecting this kind of things and taking us back again to the drawing board.
Yeah, I think you raise a lot of good points. I think part of that shared responsibility, like you mentioned, is industry stepping up, business stepping up, and sort of taking an active role in protecting soft targets. But there's only so much that you can do to a certain extent, right? So let's say, like for instance, the stadium attacks that took place a few years ago. Those attacks took place outside of the stadium before you even got to a security checkpoint, if I'm remembering correctly. So you can add security checkpoints, but where do those points end, right? So at the airport, for instance, you've got screening, right? Endless screening that can take place. You've got checkpoints that take place along the way at various airports. Well, what do you do if that attack occurs just before the checkpoint begins? It can still create mass havoc and mass casualties. So where do those checkpoints end? Part of it also might be optics. Maybe the movie theater doesn't want to have screening or detectors for guns and weapons, because that might discourage people from going to the movie theaters. I'm not saying that's right. I'm just saying I imagine that that's part of what these businesses are considering. And living within a free society here in the U.S., do we want to be subjected to that amount of those amounts of security measures? I'm not sure the answer is yes. So, but you do raise a lot of good points, and I do think that industry needs to be at the table, and they need to step up and play a role. So, yeah.
I'm a law enforcement officer, so this topic is with the community, and I engage a lot in the community interaction. And I think a part of it is law enforcement wants to work directly with the community, but I think a part of it is the community doesn't understand law enforcement is bound to constraints as far as constitutional rights and policies, whereas though you want to help, you want people to come to you and give you information, but then there's only so much you can do with the information because people have the right to bear arms or they have the right to privacy, and you can't, if someone just anonymously gives you a tip and say, I think this person might be planning an attack, okay, I could get the information anonymously, but if you don't have a credible source, is how much further could you go with this information, because you might violate their rights to privacy. So if I go to someone's house and say, we received an anonymous tip, we just want to check on you and find out is everything okay, if you say I'm fine and nothing is wrong, law enforcement is bound to, okay, they have the right to say they are fine. And then when something happens, everybody kind of say like, well, we alerted you, we gave you information. But until policy changes, the laws change, law enforcement is just in the middle and going to bear the brunt of the fact that we didn't do enough when we probably could have in the beginning. But what could you do when policy doesn't allow you to do that, or the laws doesn't? And then you have like the NRA that says everyone should be able to bear a firearm. It's their constitutional right. And then you have like our political climate now that says, guns were not responsible, or him having the access to the Las Vegas situation. Yes, he had a lot of firearms, but they're looking more so at, well, that was his constitutional right to have it, and no one should kind of question that, except those that feel as though guns were the reason behind what happened. But if law enforcement would have paid attention to him checking into the hotel with large bags and maybe knocked on his door and said, hi, what do you have in your bags? Someone might be offended if the average citizen who's not doing anything wrong, why are the police harassing me because I have large suitcases or something like that? So.
Yeah, I think that's a valid viewpoint. And like you mentioned, I think there are a lot of difficult discussions that we need to engage in as a society, not just at a national level, but it goes down, it trickles down at the local level as well. So your point's well taken.
Just comment on the videos. I think the message was very lovely, as we could see people from different backgrounds, and ethnic, religious. But I'm very pessimistic given the leadership on the larger scale. So what is the proportion of these voices? So the leadership that we see today, extremely irresponsible and hate-mongering and divisive, and it's. I don't think there's going to be. I think it's very discouraging. There are people like these, but then on the larger national scale, it's just you don't really see the effect or the influence.
Yeah, I can understand that, but I think a lot of this engagement and this working together needs to happen at the community level, the local level. I'll tell you, we're by no means perfect, but the state of New Jersey, there is a group that meets regularly with law enforcement. So this, the State Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness, the Attorney General's office, the FBI, everybody comes together and they meet on a quarterly basis with members of the community, the faith-based community. You've got community members from the Muslim community, the Sikh community, Christian, Jewish. Everybody's at the table. They're hashing out, difficult issues, talking about difficult topics. You know, it's not all about terrorism, right? It's just about various issues that the communities are facing day in and day out. The communities invite one another to their particular, you know, religious holiday events. They're building community, they're building understanding, and that's important when an event like this does take place, that you have that pre-existing network, that you are in touch with one another. Every time an incident like this happens, there's a conference call that the state puts together. They bring everyone together from the different communities, the different law enforcement agencies and various agencies of the state, the governor's office, for instance. And these individuals are there. They're there to answer questions from the community and talk about, you know, any potential threats that might be out there. But having that network is important when that incident does happen. If you don't have it, you're starting at zero. So I would encourage other communities, other states to sort of follow the model that happens here in the state of New Jersey. Yeah.
I'm interested to see the diversity, like other than the videos he's included, because it doesn't seem like based on the videos like women are included very much in these conversations. Because there's, you know, predominantly men in the videos, and he was saying like mothers have these issues, but are these mothers given platforms to share these issues? You know, like are women's stories like being accounted for, and do they have important roles as well?
Sure. So we have conducted interviews with mothers, for example, who have lost sons. You know, their sons went overseas to get training. You know, they became radicalized and went overseas to develop training and sort of join these groups in carrying out these types of attacks. So we have conducted those interviews. They do exist. They just happen to be in another language. And so I happen to just show you a small portion of the interviews that we conducted that happened to be in English. But your point is well taken. You know, it's not just a male issue. You are seeing females who are being recruited to participate in these types of activities. So there is attention being paid to females as well.
Why does targeted violence has increased past 15 years?
Why has it increased?
Yeah, because you already mentioned some development of technology, social media. Is there any other reasons in US and other?
Any reasons that I could give you would really just be my own sort of personal opinions. I think it could have to do with a hypercharged political environment. I think it could have to do with increasing intolerance so for instance, in Europe, you're seeing the rise of ultra-nationalist movements that are taking place. So that is part of what is causing these issues to take place over in Europe. Here, you know, again, it could be a variety of reasons. It's not only ideological or political. I think there are mental health issues that are going unnoticed in our communities. There's not necessarily a proper framework to get individuals help when they need it before they progress down this path to violence. So I don't think there's any one factor that is causing this. I think there are a multitude of factors and variables that are causing these issues. Access to guns, weapons, like this gentleman referenced, those are all issues. Yeah.
Yeah. I wanted to find out whether you have had any research that is linking immigration especially to this kind of violence we are having, maybe from year 2000 to in the last 15, 17 years. Do you have any research that is lending credence to immigration as a factor in this kind of explosive terrorism in the West from 2000 till date?
I do not have particular research that indicates any sort of correlation between immigration and the rise in these types of attacks. I personally do not think that it is a factor that has influenced sort of this uptick in targeted violence and mass casualty attacks. That's my opinion. Yes.
Do you think that perhaps we're using the title of mental health loosely? We're just using it because we need a reason to hold on to why some people are actually behaving that way. But in fact, they might be very mentally healthy, and they just feel as though they've been cornered and that they need to take matters into their own hands because what they believe in and people around them are not doing so themselves. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they are unhealthy mentally. It's just a label that we need to hear just to validate as to why people are behaving that way.
I hadn't really considered that myself, but it's, a valid point of view.
They might actually be
Very well. I would argue that anyone that carries out an attack, anyone who goes to the 32nd floor of a hotel building and targets innocent civilians from the 32nd floor of a hotel room is mentally unstable. But that's my.
If they have a valid point internally, then they're not. That's the thing. What's the definition of?
Well, that's the
mental
difference
illness?
between radicalization and going to violent extremism. You could have radical viewpoints and be completely sane, but where you step off to be mentally ill is when you think it's okay to harm someone to advance your cause or your thought process. And these are the people that are getting the attention.
What's sanity? What's insanity?
Dina, there's a very interesting case in Norway of Andres Breivik, and this very issue, he killed 88 students in a Norwegian island political camp. But this very issue of his sanity, he himself wanted to be considered mentally stable, and this was also going to affect his sentencing. But this very issue captured Norway for a long time, so there's a lot of research on it, which
It's really interesting. I'm trying to be the devil's advocate here, but it's something to consider. It really is. And we're just so quick to dismiss somebody. Oh, okay, the reason why he did it is because he's mentally unstable. When in fact, he might not be.
But I would recommend looking at the Norway case and maybe doing a paper on it.
I would love to.
Yeah, for sure.
So thanks for pointing that out. I'm going to look into it. Also. Any other questions? Okay. So another example that hit close to home. So the Rahami case, the alleged New Jersey, New York City bomber. The suspect's father had made comments that raised concerns about terrorism back in 2014. There is some dispute as to the extent of the alarm that was raised regarding Rahami's possible radicalization. According to the father, he told the FBI that his son had been drawn to Al-Qaeda and Taliban videos and poetry. The FBI claims that during the assessment, at no time did the father advise interviewing agents of any radicalization or alleged links to Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, or their propaganda. Furthermore, database and interagency checks to include reviews of Rahami's travel revealed no information that tied him to terrorism. So I'm not using this as an example to place blame. I'm using this as an example because I think it highlights the fact that typically in these instances, there is someone close to the perpetrator who does have information that, if brought to light, could potentially have prevented a mass casualty attack. This scenario, I think, highlights the fact that perhaps we don't have the right legal framework to trigger the appropriate level of law enforcement engagement. I think that at the end of the day, in the current threat environment, law enforcement is never going to have the ability to detect and prevent every act of targeted violence, but communities need to be involved in a certain degree in their own protection. So engagement with law enforcement is a must if we're even going to attempt to combat the threat of targeted violence and mass casualty attacks. And in conclusion, if we are expecting friends and family members to step forward to raise concerns about friends and loved ones who might be on a path to violence, local jurisdictions really have to start thinking about multidisciplinary intervention strategies to help off-ramp individuals before they engage in violent acts, and providing intervention alternatives that are going to encourage friends and family members to step forward with this information really could prevent that next incident of targeted violence. There need to be alternatives to arrest and prosecution prior to this commitment of an act of violence. Otherwise, we're really going to continue to see that reluctance to share information with law enforcement.
Yeah. Do you have any suggestions as far as personal accountability? So let's say like with that situation, his father went and told law enforcement, but what did his father do to stop his son from going for it? So that for me, for law enforcement, if we have conversation with the community and someone wants to report it and it doesn't get the response that they want from law enforcement, what can we suggest to the people to say, if you suspect someone is going to carry something out, what are you doing to try to stop them? Because you're directly involved with that person. I'm a stranger coming in. So what do you tell the family member or the friend to kind of, for them to monitor the, I guess, the elevation or escalation of the behavior?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a difficult question. No cookie cutter situation, and speaking as a parent myself, I can only imagine what that must be like for a parent to contact authorities, law enforcement, and say, hey, I think there's a problem here with my child. Imagine how incredibly difficult that must be for someone to step forward and potentially subject your own child to arrest and prosecution. So it's a difficult question. I don't know exactly what answer to give you because I think it just depends on each sort of individual case that's presented. Any other questions?
Yeah. I also want to draw from your experience in policy, because you look at all this talk about freedom, Second Amendment rights, and all this talks, then you look at the hands of the FBI or CIA as it is to really investigate some of these leaks they have. You find out that there are too much bottlenecks. So I want to have your thoughts on freedom as it has to do with such inconclusiveness in trying to investigate leads and then raise an assessment to a level that arrest or deterrence can occur.
When you refer to freedom, are you talking about privacy and civil
Privacy
liberties?
laws, liberty, yeah.
So this is obviously a big issue. Any sort of framework that you're considering when it comes to law enforcement has to operate within the confines of constitutionality. That right to privacy, it's not specifically outlined in the Constitution, but the courts have interpreted it as such, that right to privacy does exist. So any sort of framework needs to take that into account. And it's an issue, I think. I think privacy and civil liberties experts need to be at the table with law enforcement, having a frank discussion about what some of their concerns are, and law enforcement needs to have a frank discussion with what constraints they're operating under. We did a conference recently where we talked about social media and the challenges that law enforcement faces with respect to social media and identifying, potential acts of violence that, using social media as a tool during law enforcement investigations. And civil liberties experts were at the table. So the ACLU, the Brennan Center for Justice, they were there talking very honestly about what some of their concerns were. But that's just the tip of the iceberg. These conversations need to happen more frequently because privacy and civil liberties, those issues have to be taken into account when you're creating any sort of framework within a community to sort of deal with these issues. Any other questions? Yeah.
I'm curious to know how adolescents are included with personal accountability, because I think it's hard with peer pressure. For instance, when I was a sophomore in high school, a freshman brought bombs and guns to school and had them. So it was a whole big mess. But it turns out everything was on his Twitter. He talked about today was the day, all that stuff. So it's I'm sure a bunch of people saw that beforehand. So it's how to get students engaged to be hey, if you just report one thing, that can make all the difference.
Yeah, I think it's education. That needs to happen in the schools. And I think there need to be mechanisms for students to come forward and share that type of information. They need to feel comfortable. I think fear absolutely plays a role. There's probably self-doubt, oh, is this, is Michael, is he just venting on Twitter? I don't want to say anything to anyone. He might get into trouble. So I think there's a lot of that going on. I think it's important to educate children, probably at a younger age, that these issues are out there and that they need to feel comfortable stepping forward and not be afraid that their friend will be getting into trouble because they're reporting this type of information. Any other questions? Thoughts? Yeah.
Just a point. So I think combating violence, it could be, instinctual, right? There are factors, economic, political,
Sure.
whatever. But what do you guys do to address that? So, we could have two instincts, to create, to love, to but then some people, there are also instincts to destroy. So just at a normative level, what do you guys have any programs to?
The short answer is no. I think we're sort of limited in how broad we can sort of take things. So we're sort of just focusing on one particular aspect, I think, of the issue, but it's a good point. Something that should be addressed.
Thank you so much. This is extremely timely and very poignant for the moment we're in. I wanted to ask, if students want to pursue the certificate, can they come see you? What are the requirements? What
Sure.
should they be looking for?
So the program, the certificate program, will likely take place soon after the spring semester ends. I'm going to be working on the application, and I will be sending that out to students who have indicated an interest in the programs that I run. So if it's something you're interested in, maybe I'll have sort of a sheet where you can provide me with your email address, and I'll add you to my e-newsletter so that you receive information once the application comes out. It's pretty standard. You provide your resume, you do a short statement of interest. It's not that cumbersome at all. It was pretty competitive last year. We were only able to accept 30 students, mostly because of that simulation exercise that I told you that the state ran, and the students were doing that practical skills building, engaging as Intel analysts. I wish I could expand it further, but unfortunately we could only handle 30 students because of that exercise component. So if you're interested, I'm happy to give you my email address. If you have any questions about the program at all, feel free to contact me. And also, I'd be happy to add you to our newsletter so that you get information about that program, internships, potential job openings, because these things do come across my desk. And I'm sure some of you are at the point of graduation and thinking about those next steps. So if it's something you're thinking about, I'm happy to meet with you or speak with you by phone, whatever works.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.